It was a quiet Friday night, the kind where silence stretches long and time feels suspended. I was driving an empty multiple-unit train, tasked with parking it in a yard in another city. No passengers, no conductors, just me and the rhythmic hum of the engine. The route stretched through remote countryside, where the darkness was thick, and the only light came from the dim glow of the control panel and the train's headlights cutting through the night. These solitary drives were usually uneventful, almost meditative. But this night was different. Halfway through the journey, as I passed through a stretch of open fields bordered by shadowy trees, the monotony was shattered. The sound of the intercom system rang out, its mechanical chime reverberating in the cab. My heart jolted. It wasn't a sound I expected to hear tonight. The intercom system was designed for communication between the cabs, useful for conductors during reversing maneuvers. But I was alone. I froze for a moment, staring at the control panel as the chime continued. Each note seemed louder than the last, cutting through the silence like a knife. A chill crept up my spine. Steeling myself, I reached out and pressed the rocker switch to accept the call. The button required firm pressure, its spring mechanism resisting slightly before clicking into place. "Hello." My voice echoed in the empty cab. The other end was silent. Just static, faint but persistent, like a whisper from the void. "Hello." I tried again, my voice firmer now, masking the unease curling in my chest. Still, there was no response. The chime stopped. For a moment, I sat there, listening to the hum of the engine and the soft rattle of the train as it sped along the tracks. My rational mind told me it was just a technical glitch, a quirk of the aging electronics. But the isolation of the night played tricks on me, filling the silence with phantom sounds and shadows that seemed to flicker at the edges of my vision. I glanced at the rearview monitors, which displayed grainy feeds from the cameras in the other compartments. Empty. Every single compartment was deserted, just as I had left them. Shaking my head, I focused on the track ahead, the glow of the signals guiding me through the dark. Yet, I couldn't shake the unease. The cabin felt colder now, the air heavy with something unexplainable. About 10 minutes later, just as I was beginning to convince myself it was nothing, the intercom chimed again. My breath caught. This time, I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stared at the button, half expecting it to move on its own. The chime was relentless, filling the cab with its mechanical insistence. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the button again. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to sound authoritative. The static returned, but this time, it wasn't alone. Faintly, beneath the crackle, there was a sound. A whisper, so soft it was almost imperceptible. I strained to listen, my fingers gripping the edge of the console. The words were indistinct, but they carried an eerie, rhythmic quality, as if someone, or something, was reciting a mantra. I released the button, and the intercom fell silent. By the time I arrived at the yard, my nerves were frayed. The quiet of the station felt oppressive rather than comforting. Before shutting down the train, I decided to do a walkthrough, a routine inspection I'd never felt less routine about. Armed with a flashlight, I moved through each compartment, the beam slicing through the darkness. The empty seats loomed like silent witnesses, their shadows dancing with the sway of the light. As I reached the last compartment, I stopped. There was someone, seated at the very back. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, unable to move. Slowly, I adjusted the flashlight, the beam revealing nothing but an empty seat. My breath came in shallow gasps as I realized it was just the trick of a shadow, the interplay of light and imagination. I finished my inspection, confirming what I already knew. The train was empty. Still, as I locked up and stepped off the train, the feeling of being watched lingered, pressing against the back of my neck. To this day, I tell myself it was a glitch in the system, a malfunction in the intercom caused by old wiring or some harmless electronics. When I was 14, an unexpected walk home turned into a night I would never forget. My grandfather, who usually picked me up from the train station, had called to say he couldn't make it. With no other choice, I braced myself for the 5-kilometer trek to our little cottage. The problem wasn't the distance, it was the route. The cottage was nestled at the edge of a dense forest, accessible only by a narrow, winding trail. It was late autumn, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed into an eerie labyrinth of shadows. The air was crisp, biting at my skin, and the scattered crunch of fallen leaves underfoot was the only sound accompanying me. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me, slipped on my over-ear headphones, and started walking. Music had always been my refuge, but tonight it felt like a barrier, a self-imposed blindfold in a place where I needed my senses sharp. A man I had noticed earlier on the train boarded at the same stop as me. I barely paid him any attention then, but now, as I started down the isolated trail, I realized he was still behind me. He was in his mid-30s to early 40s, with short brown hair and an unassuming appearance, ordinary in a way that somehow made him more unsettling. I shook off the unease. There were plenty of cabins scattered around the forest. He could just be heading to one of them. But as the trees closed in around me, the number of plausible explanations dwindled. The trail was uneven, scattered with roots and rocks. Every time I stumbled, the soft sound of his footsteps behind me quickened my pulse. At first, they were distant, almost rhythmic, but as the trail grew narrower, his steps seemed closer, more deliberate. I paused my music, pretending to adjust my headphones, and strained to listen. The crunch of leaves stopped the moment I did. My stomach knotted as I realized he was timing his movements with mine. I quickened my pace, my breath clouding in the cold air. The path ahead forked, one route leading to the open meadow, and the other diving deeper into the forest. The meadow would add an extra kilometer to my walk, but it was lit by the faint glow of a distant cabin. My gut told me to head that way. As I veered toward the meadow, I heard his pace quicken too. Panic gripped me. The open field was still 500 meters ahead, and I wasn't sure I'd make it. I broke into a run. Leaves scattered beneath my pounding feet as the sound of his pursuit grew louder. My heart raced, not just from the exertion, but from pure terror. Who was this man? What did he want? The trail dipped into a small gully, the damp air clinging to my skin. I stumbled on a root, barely catching myself before I hit the ground. Behind me, the sound of his footsteps faltered briefly, but then they surged forward with renewed energy. As I reached the edge of the meadow, I saw the cabin's light flickering in the distance. Hope surged through me, but the man was too close now. I could feel it. My legs burned as I sprinted, my jacket flapping wildly behind me. When I reached the open field, I turned briefly to look. The man had stopped at the tree line, his silhouette barely visible against the darkness of the forest. He was standing still, watching me. I bolted toward the cabin, shouting for help. My voice echoed in the stillness, but no one answered. The light flickered again, and I realized it was a motion sensor light. Not a sign of life, just an automated fixture. As I turned back toward the forest, the man was gone. The emptiness of the tree line was somehow more terrifying than his presence. Was he hiding? Waiting? I didn't stop running until I reached the far side of the meadow, where the trail led back toward the main road and my cottage. When I finally reached the door, I collapsed inside, locking it behind me. My grandfather, groggy from sleep, asked what had happened. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to explain, but he dismissed it as an overactive imagination. Still trembling, I peeked out the window, half expecting to see the man at the edge of the clearing. And there he was, standing just beyond the glow of the motion sensor light. His figure was barely visible in the shadows. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared. For what felt like an eternity, he stood there before finally melting back into the darkness of the forest. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Perhaps it was a cruel prank, or maybe I narrowly escaped something far worse. I never saw him again, but the memory of that night lingers. Even now, years later, the sound of footsteps behind me can send my heart racing, and I avoid the forest trail at all costs. It was the early days of December 2020, and the pandemic still gripped the city. Everyone was living in a haze of masks and fear, trying to adjust to a new, unfamiliar world. I worked as a janitor at a hospital, cleaning late at night after most of the staff had gone home. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I was tired that night, exhausted really. My shift ended at midnight, and I just wanted to get home to sleep, to forget about the constant news about the virus and the endless stress. The last train of the night was always my ride, and tonight, I was barely staying awake on the platform. The station was quieter than usual. The flickering lights above me added an unsettling atmosphere to the already eerie silence. When the train finally arrived, I barely registered it at first. I stepped aboard, rubbing my eyes, and found a seat toward the back of the section. The train started moving with its usual rattle, but something felt wrong. The section was almost empty, just a few other people scattered throughout. The hum of the wheels against the tracks was oddly loud in the silence. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe people were still avoiding public transport due to the pandemic. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the window at the city rushing past. Everything was blurry in the cold, and the streets seemed emptier than usual. Then I noticed a man sitting near the opposite end of the section. He was dressed in a dark coat, and his eyes were glued to the floor. At first, I thought he was just another commuter, but then I realized he hadn't moved once since I boarded. His posture was rigid, too stiff, and the more I looked, the more unsettling it became. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. Every now and then, I'd glance over, and his head would still be down, but something about his stillness made my skin crawl. Eventually, I pulled out my phone to distract myself, but there was no signal. It wasn't uncommon, I thought. The train sometimes lost connection underground. The train slowed down as we approached the next stop. The man didn't move. I noticed, too, that the others in the section hadn't moved either. The door to the next section slid open, and the man stood up. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he was thinking about each step before he made it. He walked toward the door separating the sections and stopped. I couldn't take my eyes off him. Just before he stepped through, he turned around and looked directly at me. For a brief moment, our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something cold, distant, and almost predatory. Then, without a word, he stepped through the door and disappeared into the next section. The hairs on my neck prickled. I should have gone to the conductor, asked what was going on, but the train was already moving, and I didn't want to seem paranoid or make a scene. A few minutes passed. The train picked up speed, rattling against the tracks. The air felt colder now, even though the heater was running. It was an uncomfortable, oppressive kind of cold. The train felt empty, hollow, like it was just a vehicle passing through an abandoned world. I decided to move. I stood up and walked toward the door to the next section. As I approached, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. It wasn't something I'd seen before. Usually, the doors were locked, especially this late at night. I pushed the door open, stepping into the next section, and my stomach dropped. It was exactly the same as the last one. Empty, dimly lit, and cold. But there was no sign of the man. He wasn't there. I turned to leave, but something made me stop. A low, unsettling noise, like the creaking of old wood, came from the far end of the section. I froze. There, sitting alone in one of the seats, was the man. His coat was different now, faded, worn. But he was still staring straight ahead, completely motionless. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I didn't understand what was happening, but the longer I stared at him, the more I realized something was horribly wrong. The train jerked, and I was thrown off balance. I grabbed onto a pole to steady myself. When I looked back, the man was gone. I felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. I quickly moved back to the other section, but the moment I stepped through, the train lurched violently. The lights flickered and went out, and the train seemed to slow down, as if it was losing speed. I glanced around the section. The other passengers were still there, but they were slouched, unresponsive, like they were frozen in time. I knew then, I was alone on this train. The train stopped abruptly. I looked out the window. Nothing. No station. No lights, just endless darkness, stretching out forever. I pounded on the door to the conductor's cabin. No response. I tried the emergency exit, but it wouldn't open. I was trapped. I don't know how long I stayed there, my heart racing, listening to the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty train. Eventually, the doors opened again, and I didn't question it. I just ran. The platform was empty, no signs, no workers. Just an old, dilapidated station that I had never seen before. I ran down the tracks, and after what felt like hours, I found my way back to the main station. No one believed me when I told them. They said the trains were on a regular schedule that night. No delays. But then, a few days later, I overheard something unsettling at work. The night I'd taken the train, a disturbing incident had occurred on the very same train. A woman had boarded, only to disappear moments later. Security footage showed her stepping into a section of the train, and then nothing. No sign of her after that. The police couldn't explain it. There were reports of passengers hearing strange sounds. Metal scraping, whispers, even screams, coming from an empty section of the train after it left the station that night.